Somewhere in England, behind the secure walls of Broadmoor Hospital, a man convicted of murder has spent more of his life confined than free. For decades, his name remained unfamiliar to much of the public. Most people remember the name Colin Stagg, the man who was publicly accused, arrested, and placed at the center of one of Britain's most notorious murder investigations. An investigation that ultimately proved he was innocent. But this documentary isn't about the man who was wrongly accused. It's about the man investigators overlooked, despite warnings that came years before the murder. July 15, 1992. An ordinary morning on Wimbledon Common in southwest London. 23-year-old Rachel Nickell was walking her dog with her 2-year-old son, Alex, just as she did most days. By the time it was over, Rachel Nickell had been stabbed 49 times. Her son was found beside her. He was just 2 years old, too young to explain what had happened. The attack took place in broad daylight, on one of London's best-known public commons. There was no obvious suspect, no eyewitness who could identify the killer, very little forensic evidence, only a brutal crime scene, and a nation demanding answers. The Metropolitan Police launched one of the biggest murder investigations in the country. Hundreds of officers were assigned to the case. Every lead mattered. Every witness was interviewed. The pressure to solve the murder grew with every passing day. And under that pressure, the investigation began moving toward the wrong man. While detectives searched in one direction, the person responsible remained free. To understand how this happened, you have to go back further than the murder itself. Robert Napper was born in 1966 in southeast London, the eldest of 4 children in a violent household. He and his siblings regularly witnessed domestic violence between their parents. When his parents eventually divorced, the children were placed in foster care and underwent years of psychiatric treatment. He was later diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and autism spectrum disorder. At 12, he was allegedly sexually assaulted by a family friend. Those close to him say his behavior changed after that. He grew withdrawn, aggressive toward his siblings. By 19, he'd had his first brush with the law, a fine for carrying a loaded airgun in public. It was a quiet, troubled start. In October 1989, nearly 3 years before Rachel Nickell was killed, Napper's own mother picked up the phone and called the police. She told them her son had confessed to raping a woman on Plumstead Common. Officers checked their records. They found nothing matching. No case, no report they could connect it to. I told them my son had raped a woman, but they said there'd been no rape and that he must have made it up, she later told reporters. There was no follow-up, no further inquiry. The case was closed before it ever really opened. Meanwhile, across southeast London, a pattern was quietly forming, a series of knife-point attacks on lone women in wooded areas, attacks that would later become known as the Green Chain Rapes. By the time Rachel Nickell was murdered in 1992, Napper wasn't a stranger to police. He was already part of the Green Chain investigation. 2 separate members of the public had called in to say Napper resembled a composite sketch of the suspect. Twice, officers tried to bring him in for a blood sample. Twice, he simply didn't show up. He was eliminated as a suspect anyway, reportedly because of his height. The man witnesses described was shorter than him. Nobody accounted for the fact that Napper walked with a stoop. 2 chances, 2 warnings, both missed, while detectives focused their attention elsewhere. With Napper eliminated, police turned their attention elsewhere, to a local man named Colin Stagg. There was no forensic evidence linking him to the crime at all, but he fit a psychological profile, and he was known to walk his dog on the common. Police ran a controversial undercover operation, using an officer posing as a romantic interest to try to draw out a confession. It didn't work. Stagg was arrested, held for over a year, and eventually stood trial, before a judge threw the case out entirely, condemning the tactics used against him as, in his words, deceptive conduct of the grossest kind. Stagg walked free, but by then, the damage of public suspicion had already been done to him, and somewhere else. The real danger hadn't stopped. While Colin Stagg sat in custody, still viewed by much of the public as Rachel Nickell's killer, Robert Napper was still free, nearly 16 months after Rachel's murder. He struck again. In November 1993, Napper broke into the home of 27-year-old Samantha Bissett in Plumstead, southeast London. Inside the house were Samantha and her 4-year-old daughter, Jasmine. He murdered them both. Unlike the Rachel Nickell investigation, this crime scene left behind evidence. Investigators recovered a fingerprint, a shoe print, and other forensic evidence linking Napper directly to the house. This time, there was no psychological profile, no undercover operation, no guesswork. The evidence pointed to one man. Robert Napper was arrested. In 1995, he admitted responsibility for the murders on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Instead of being sent to prison, he was detained indefinitely at Broadmoor Hospital, one of Britain's highest security psychiatric hospitals. At that point, the Samantha Bissett investigation had been solved, but Rachel Nickell's murder remained officially unsolved. No one yet knew that the same man was responsible for both crimes. It would take another 13 years, and advances in DNA technology.
I said, get up, man, with all my strength. And that split second, even though I was very young, I knew that she was gone and she was never coming back. So.
For years, Rachel Nickell's murder remained unsolved. The investigation that had once dominated headlines had gone cold, but forensic science had not stood still. By the mid-2000s, advances in DNA technology gave investigators an opportunity to re-examine evidence collected from the crime scene. In 1992, the evidence was tested again. This time, the results were clear. In 2006, DNA linked Robert Napper to Rachel Nickell's murder. 2 years later, in 2008, he admitted responsibility on the grounds of diminished responsibility because of his mental illness. The case that had remained unanswered for 16 years was finally solved. For Colin Stagg, the DNA evidence did more than identify the real killer. It finally cleared his name. After years of being portrayed as Britain's most notorious murder suspect, he had proof that he had been innocent all along. The Metropolitan Police later issued a public apology to Stagg for the way the investigation had been handled. Senior officers also acknowledged that opportunities to stop Robert Napper had been missed. A former assistant commissioner admitted that, had those early warnings been properly investigated, police might have prevented not only Rachel Nickell's murder, but the murders of Samantha Bissett and her 4-year-old daughter, Jasmine. Today, Robert Napper remains detained at Broadmoor Hospital. He has spent more of his life inside secure psychiatric
so blessed.
Hospitals than he ever spent living freely.
This has been so much more than a job for everyone.
The Rachel Nickell investigation is remembered today for 2 reasons. It exposed one of the most controversial murder investigations in modern British policing, and it showed the devastating consequences of pursuing the wrong suspect while the real killer remained at large. 3 innocent people lost their lives. An innocent man lost years of his life, his reputation, and his peace.